Brock Purdy just had a spectacular season, and I think a lot of people have been disrespecting him and his performances, and I'll throw my hat in that name too. I've been very disrespectful of who Brock Purdy is, and to an extent, I owe an apology to everybody who's a Brock Purdy truther. But with that being said, this is an analysis channel, so I have to be very analytical with my assessment of certain players. So today, I want to use my analytical aspects to figure out if Brock Purdy is truly a top 10 to top 5 quarterback. So with that being said, let's hop into it. So for me, if you're talking about a top 10 list, I think there has to be 6 guys who must be in your top 10, because if they're not, I have to question your top 10. And those 6 guys are, of course, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, and Dak Prescott. I know the last one might confuse some people, but yes, Dak Prescott is a top 10 quarterback whether you like it or not. I think if your list does not have these guys in some aspect on your list, I think your list is a little bit questionable. Now, I'm not saying those are your top 6 guys, but I think those guys are easily in the top 10. But I also think there's a lot of guys we have to consider for those last 4 spots in my top 10. And those guys are Tua Tagovailoa, Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, Jared Goff, Brock Purdy, Matthew Stafford, Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers, Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Trevor Lawrence, and Kirk Cousins. Now, I've decided to do kind of a broad list of players who you could discuss to potentially put in your top 10, and while of course top 10 lists are always going to be about your own personal opinions, I'm going to use my unbiased and analytical opinion to give you guys a true assessment of whether or not Brock Purdy is a top 10 quarterback. Now again, those 6 guys who I said you must have in your top 10 aren't necessarily the 6 best quarterbacks. Now I'm going to put my case out there and say that those guys are the 6 best quarterbacks in the NFL, and I think the way I said it with Mahomes, Allen, Lamar, Burrow, Herbert, Dak is probably the order I would go down. I still do think there's a case you can have other guys above them, regardless. So then you got to ask yourself, who are the 4 last guys? Now I've given you guys the list of names. I think we can go ahead and eliminate a few names on that list. For starters, Trevor Lawrence, Baker Mayfield, Aaron Rodgers, Kyler Murray could all be kicked off the list because, well, they didn't really have the greatest years last year, or maybe they had some injuries, or they're just not top 10 caliber. So then that leaves us with a list of Tua Tagovailoa, Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, Jared Goff, Brock Purdy, Matthew Stafford, Jalen Hurts, and Kirk Cousins. Now, when we're assessing a top 10 list, you can look at it in a couple different ways. Are we basing this list off of just 1 year, which was last year, or are we basing this list off their production of work throughout their entire careers? And to me, I don't think it's really fair to look at the entire careers, because then we're taking out guys like Brock Purdy, Jordan Love, and CJ Stroud for basically no reason. So I think this has to be a list where we combine not only their performance last year, but what we know those quarterbacks truly are. So I think you look at guys like Jalen Hurts, Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins, Tua, and you can say that those guys have been good quarterbacks for several years now. And with only 4 spots remaining, it's going to get really hard to necessarily just kick certain people out. I think there's one name on this list who I think you have to put in your top 10. Again, if you take him off your top 10, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I think he has to be in, and that's Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford this year, regardless of what the stats say, played like a top 10 quarterback. He was freaking fantastic, and if you actually watched the games, he was great. I know he had some turnover problems. I know he wasn't always perfect, but Matthew Stafford, in my opinion, is a top 10 quarterback. Now again, he may not be the 7th best quarterback, but I do think he's locked in at top 10, so that only leaves us with 3 spots remaining. And with 7 names there, we gotta cut down some more names, and this is getting a little bit more difficult. Now, the whole knock on Brock Purdy, and this is a knock that I've been having on Brock Purdy throughout his career, is the simple fact that, well, he's got a fantastic team and coaching staff around him. And while that might not be the most fair assessment of a quarterback, I do think it is something that we do have to take into account. You look at a guy like Justin Herbert and Jordan Love, with what they were able to do with the players they had around them in comparison to what Brock Purdy's doing with the players around him, there is a bit of a case there to be said. Brock Purdy, at the end of the day, has Offensive Player of the Year Christian McCaffrey, great head coach in Kyle Shanahan, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Trent Williams, mediocre offensive line outside of that, but still, and a good defense. And I think if you take that into account, that does potentially knock him a couple points down. Now again, I'm not going to take that in too much into account here for this list, because I don't really know if that's a fair assessment for a quarterback, given that most of these quarterbacks on this list do actually have good teams around him. Like Jared Goff, good team around him. Jalen Hurts, great team around him. Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, Lamar, Josh Allen, Mahomes. So that is kind of the counter argument to my statement, but at the end of the day, I do want to take that still a little bit into account, because he truly does have the Avengers surrounding him. So with that being said, I still do think that Brock Purdy has a great argument to be a top 10 quarterback. Now, I think there's one name here on this list that I think we can take out, and that's only because he doesn't really have the body of work to be proven to be a top 10 quarterback consistently, and that is Kirk Cousins. Now, to me, that does hurt to keep Kirk Cousins off the list because before he got injured this year, he was playing like a top 5 quarterback. In my opinion, he was up there for the MVP, but they weren't winning a lot of games, and Kirk Cousins was kind of padding his stats because, well, he kind of had to. I do think when he comes back next year, if he's totally fine, I think he could be a top 10 quarterback, but for this list heading into 2024, with Brock Purdy being in the conversation, I don't really know if we can necessarily throw him in there. So that then leaves us with 6 names. And those, of course, do include Brock Purdy. I think the next name that we can potentially take off this list here is Jalen Hurts. Now, before Eagles fans get mad at me, I think we have to be very honest about what he did last year. He didn't have a great year, even when they were winning games. Sure, Jalen Hurts had great performances against teams like Buffalo and Dallas in their first game, and Kansas City to an extent. But I think we have to be very honest with what he did the entire year. He wasn't fantastic. He had a lot of turnovers, he was getting a lot of touchdowns from the tush push, and he just didn't really look like a top 10 quarterback at times. Now, I know last year he was obviously a top 10 to even potentially top 5 quarterback. And that's not me saying that Jalen Hurts can't be in that top 10 conversation, but I think if we're looking at his whole body of work in comparison to some of these other guys, it's a little bit questionable. So we're going to take Jalen Hurts off this list, which then leaves us with Tua, Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, Jared Goff, and Brock Purdy. Now, I know what everyone's going to say, why is Tua still on this list? Well, I think we have to be very honest with Tua Tagovailoa. He's a great regular season quarterback who can throw up a ton of stats, but when it comes down to playoff time, he really hasn't had the circumstances around him to really be successful in the playoffs. And for me, this is a list of regular season and playoff performances. I don't think we should just knock Tua because he hasn't been good in the playoffs. If that's the case, we can also throw out Justin Herbert and Dak Prescott, and maybe Lamar Jackson. So I don't think it's really fair to just kick Tua off because, well, he sucks in the playoffs. But at the same time, that does play a little bit into my opinion. Now, when discussing Tua Tagovailoa, I do think that we do have to take a little bit into some context here as to why I'm not going to put him above Brock Purdy. And the reason why I'm not going to put him above Brock Purdy is a simple fact that Brock Purdy has been basically a better version of Tua in a sense. Tua plays within the confines of his system. When the play breaks down around him, Tua's not making too many plays. He's not really a great running quarterback. He can't really make plays out of structure, whereas Brock Purdy can. And I think it'd be unfair for me to be critical of Brock Purdy because he plays with the guys around him and be critical of him because he plays within the system, when Brock Purdy clearly can do a little bit better than what Tua can when it comes down to when the play around him isn't necessarily there. So while I'm not going to take Tua off my top 10 necessarily, I am going to say this: if Tua's in the top 10, so is Brock Purdy. So then we go down the list and talk about Jordan Love. And to me, this is a really interesting one because he had half the year where he was playing like an MVP and half the year where he was playing like a top 25 quarterback. And to me, there's not really a world where I can put Jordan Love above a guy like Brock Purdy when he's only had half a good season. So with that being said, we're going to have to take Jordan Love off the top 10 just because he hasn't had that consistency throughout his entire career. So then going down the list again, we now have CJ Stroud. And I think, yes, it could be a little bit too early to put him top 10, but given how dominant he was in his first year, I do think that he has to be in some deep consideration to be top 10. And the reason why is, well, he played like an MVP level through a lot of the season. He doesn't throw interceptions, he's good with the football, he can run with the football, he's good out of structure, he's good in structure, and look at the talent around him in comparison to what guys like Brock Purdy have around him. Stroud does, in my opinion, more with less. So we're going to put CJ Stroud in my top 10. So that now leaves us with 2 more spots in our top 10. Right now our list is looking like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Dak Prescott, and then Matthew Stafford, and then CJ Stroud. And with Tua, Jared Goff, and Brock Purdy still being on the list, I think it's pretty obvious where I'm going with this. Jared Goff, unfortunately, you're not going to be in our top 10. I think you're going to be right on the outside looking in, and I think there's a good reason for that. Jared Goff hasn't really proven to be a guy who can carry a bad roster. Now, Brock Purdy hasn't had to do that either, and I think that is a good debate to have there. But Brock Purdy has done more with more than Jared Goff has done with his more. If that makes sense, hopefully it does. So unfortunately, I don't see a world where I could put Jared Goff above Tua either, because Tua, at the end of the day, has put up MVP-like stats with a relatively good roster around him. Now, the roster around him is not as good as Jared Goff's, but I will say the system is just as good. So I have to put Tua above Jared Goff, and with that being said, I also have to put Brock Purdy above Jared Goff. So that being said, Jared Goff is off our top 10, and our top 10 is complete. Now, I'm not going to necessarily put these guys in a particular order because I don't want to necessarily offend anyone with putting a guy like Dak over this guy or Herbert over this guy. So we're just going to give you guys the top 10 players, and I'm going to have you guys just debate in the comment section below what order you would have them in. Again, I'm not going to give a particular order here, but this is just the top 10 guys in no particular order. That would be Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Dak Prescott, Matthew Stafford, Brock Purdy, CJ Stroud, and Tua Tagovailoa. Now, to finish off this video, I thought I'd do a little bit of a Brock Purdy discussion because, as I said in the very beginning of this video, I've been fairly critical of Brock Purdy, and to an extent, he really doesn't deserve the criticism that I've given him. A lot of the criticisms I have about Brock Purdy are the simple fact that he's playing with so much. He has, as I mentioned, all-pro player after all-pro player around him. But we also don't have this discussion about guys like Dak Prescott. We don't have those same discussions with guys like Lamar Jackson or Joe Burrow or Patrick Mahomes. We don't have those same discussions with guys like Matthew Stafford or Jared Goff or Jalen Hurts. So I think it's unfair for us to just completely dismiss Brock Purdy and say he's not top 10 because of the guys around him. Now, when I was watching the Super Bowl last night, I thought he played fantastic. Now, I know statistically he didn't have a just otherworldly game. But if you watch the game and had the roles been reversed, had the Niners won the championship, I think everyone would be singing the praise of Brock Purdy. People are going to come out today and say Brock Purdy was the reason why they lost. They're wrong. 110% wrong. And I'm one of those guys who's been blaming Brock Purdy for some of their losses this year. He's not to blame for their Super Bowl loss. Because at the end of the day, I think there's more people that need to be blamed defensively, coaching wise, and maybe some offensive players who didn't really show up. Because to me, Brock Purdy made several game-changing plays. People forget the Christian McCaffrey dump-off when he was getting sacked. People forget the Kyle Juszczyk first down that was an incredible play by Brock Purdy. People forget those. And I think it's a shame that because they lost the game, not necessarily because of Brock Purdy, but people are going to put this on Brock Purdy when they really shouldn't. Now, shout out to Brock Purdy for going out there and saying that he could have played better, because in a sense, he probably could have played better. But I don't think it's fair for us necessarily to just completely dismiss Brock Purdy as a top 10 quarterback because of a good performance in the Super Bowl. At the end of the day, how many quarterbacks in our top 10 have made it to a Super Bowl? Mahomes, Stafford, Burrow. Those are the three guys who made it to a Super Bowl. 3 of the top 10 guys have made a Super Bowl. Now you can throw Brock Purdy in there, so that makes 4. I don't think it's fair for us to just completely dismiss Brock Purdy. He's top 10, and I hate to say it because I'm a Cowboys, Raiders fan, and having a Niners quarterback top 10 sucks. But yeah, I owe an apology to Brock Purdy. I owe an apology to Niners fans. Niners fans, you have a guy.